Hey, LinkedIn, and welcome back to Business Unusual. This is a live show where we're talking as a community about how the coronavirus is impacting the ways that we all work. I'm Caroline Fairchild, editor-at-large at LinkedIn, coming to you from my home office here in New York City. Protests against the deaths of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and police brutality have rightfully dominated the headlines, as well as conversations both on and off LinkedIn. And while it may be easier for white workers like myself to ignore these realities when we step into the office, virtual or not, underrepresented groups whose lives are deeply impacted by these events do not have the same luxury. On today's show, we are going to have a conversation with a panel of experts about how to step up and be an active ally for your colleagues during this challenging time. This is a conversation that we've had before on LinkedIn. In February, I published an article about discussing race at work. It was shared over 1,000 times, had got more than 700 comments, which speaks to the importance of this topic. I wanted to revisit it again, given the news, as well as the unique challenges that working remotely presents in terms of being there for your colleagues and showing support. On today's show, we're going to speak about that, and we're going to hear from a group of panelists about this conversation. But before we do that, I want to hear from you. What's going on in your community? How are things going on the ground? What questions do you have about active allyship? We want to have a conversation with you about that on today's show. And before I bring on our panelists, I wanted to start with a baseline for our conversation. And my colleagues have been sharing some resources about how bosses can be active allies. Being authentic is important, recognizing a person may not be ready to talk and asking questions and being honest about what you don't know, which is something that's challenging for a lot of leaders, but it's critical during this challenging time. We're going to talk about this more on today's show with our panel of experts, and I'm going to bring them on right now. We have Minda Hart. She is the author of The Memo. We have Megan Carpenter joining us from Microsoft, Jess Fish from the Attaway Group, as well as Torin Perez, who is a thought leader in this space as well. I want to thank my panel so much for joining me during this time.
Thank you for having us.
Minda, I want to start with you. It hasn't been that many months since you started this book. Since you wrote your book, how are things going for you? I know that you're quarantining upstate, and how have these events been, impacting you?
Yeah, it's interesting because when I came off the road, Caroline, I was on the road for almost 8 months with my book. And when I came off, I thought, this will probably slow down the conversation, but it's actually increased the conversation because equity for women of color in the workplace is still very important. And even more so during the inequalities that are going on right now. I'm hearing from a lot of people in my network saying, I hope that my manager says something about what's going on. I hope that our CEO says something that's going on. But not only that, how are they treating us inside of the workplace? Is there representation at the highest level? So they're really looking for true leadership right now. And it's going to require many of our leaders to be courageous leaders in this time.
Right. We were just discussing at the top of the show how many hundreds of executives are on LinkedIn right now talking about this very important topic, which is unprecedented. And I think a very, motivating sign of where we are going with this conversation. Torin, how are you? I know you've had a busy weekend starting Move for Justice, which I want to hear more about, but I just want to know how your family is doing and how you're responding to this very challenging weekend that we all just had.
This has been just probably the most challenging 2 months of my life. March 27th, I was doing a webinar on D&I, and the call that I received immediately after was that my uncle passed away from COVID. He went into the ER the night before and didn't last 24 hours in there. And so I had to wrestle with all of the grief and all of the loss and not being able to kind of put a bookend to his life with my family at that moment. And I didn't have the energy or the reservoir to give to this work how I'm accustomed to giving to it. And about a month or so ago, I started kind of getting back to being myself again and feeling the energy. And just these past couple of weeks, I think about all of the things that drive me and fuel my fire that I'm seeing now palpable across the nation and people who are showing up in these protests. We have to be killed. We have to die. We have to go viral. We have to be recorded to matter. And I feel like that's just not enough. Like, that's not good enough, And if it requires this kind of, social outcry from something so unacceptable like this, I want us to have that same energy right now for George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, but I also want us to have that same energy for all of the things that our corporations also need to be caring about, which is all of the other inequities that Minda is an expert on and our other panelists are experts on in terms of the way that we create and cultivate our inclusive and equitable corporate workspaces. But this weekend, what happened is I recently started running. I needed some place to exert my energy and just feel like I could just feel like I'm getting ready to do something. I wanted to do something. And I don't have all the answers, but Friday night I went out for a run. And this was right after I got off of Highway 101, where protesters had blocked the highway, and then 87, where I literally witnessed the protesters walking up the highway before I was exiting. So I literally saw this firsthand, and they say proximity is power. And so that was in my body fresh. And as I was running, I was like, let me just take a quick video and say, I'm running for justice. I sent it to my brother-in-law. The next morning he wakes up, he sends me a video, challenges another family member. And he says, hey, I got a bad knee, but I'll bike for justice. So this idea just kind of came together. Like, how could we make this thing inclusive for all the people who may not feel like they are safe to show up to protests or things of that nature, but they want to show up to this work. They want to activate their allyship right now, add their voice, break their silence. This is for them. This Move for Justice campaign, it's going to harness social media around, Instagram. You can follow us, Move for Justice. You could engage with us on the hashtag on TikTok as well. We just put up a website. The goal of the website is really just to get you engaged with this, to break that silence and take the challenge. There's a number of top resources and organizations to give to, just like what you may be seeing circulating, just all kind of harnessed in one place. And this is a community project. So if you are inspired by this, if you want to be a part of this, if you want to give to this, I welcome you to join in, because as you can see, there's just so much that we need to do right now, and we do it better together. So right. I feel super inspired.
Torin, thank you so much for sharing that. I want to share that there are many members in the stream sending condolences for your loss. So thank you for sharing that and for all that you're doing. I want to say hello to some members in the stream: Carrie from Chicago, Ramona from Dallas, Casey from Spain, Beth from Alabama, John from Memphis. Thank you so much for joining us. This is Business Unusual. We're having a conversation about the protests here in the United States and how to be an active ally for your colleague during this challenging time. Megan, you wrote about this very topic last week on LinkedIn, which is why I reached out to you. And you express this feeling of exhaustion, which I want to talk with you about. And this gets at this notion that white workers asking Black colleagues how to be an ally, almost like we're giving you homework. Talk to me a little bit about that emotion of exhaustion and how you came out on the other end of that and where you are right now in terms of helping your colleagues be allies and how that's changed.
Yeah, for sure. And, I'll start by actually saying, while yes, our white colleagues at the company are certainly part of the conversation, one of the things I think about is how all of us can show up for allies as allies for each other. And so what we're thinking about is, how do we be more thoughtful about ensuring we understand what people in the community need? We talk a little bit about the difference between eager allyship and informed allyship. The passion is great. The energy is great. But especially when we think about the workplace, our opportunity is to start by understanding what members of the community actually need. So are you asking the question rather than assuming that the act that you're going to take is going to help? Are you listening to what people are saying they need so that we can show up in the way that is most impactful? When I think about my own opportunity for allyship as this work is happening, as these conversations are happening, we also recognize things like there is massive xenophobia and hate being directed to some of our Asian colleagues in places around the US and around the world. And so we're trying to be more thoughtful about the ways that anyone can show up as an ally. The struggle is making sure that we're being thoughtful, that we're being intentional, and that we're doing it in a way that is going to add to something meaningful, both inside the company and out. We talk about making sure that we're not just changing individual behavior, though that's important. We're also talking about making sure that we're not just driving systemic change if we're not reflecting the change in our own behavior. So it's finding a way to show up on both sides and, drive larger change in the long run.
And Jessica, this is your work. You work with companies to build anti-racist cultures. I want to know how that work is changing now that we are all in these little boxes remotely. And for those on the stream who are wanting to be there for their colleagues during this challenging time, what can you tell us about ways to do that and to be an active ally?
Yeah, you know, one of the things that folks have been doing that we've been working with is actually creating affinity groups for white colleagues to get on and talk to each other and to really ask hard questions. And I think this is a huge part of the work is as white folks, we have to be asking ourselves, what am I willing to give up for justice? What am I willing to give up in terms of power, of money, of time, of resources? How am I willing to hold leadership accountable, to hold and call in my white colleagues? We have to be willing to use the language. We have to be willing to acknowledge that white supremacy and white dominant culture is embedded in our organizations. It's there every time we ask the question, well, we want a good cultural fit. What does that look like? You know, we expect folks to come in who are going to sound like us, talk like us, look like us, and we're asking folks to conform. And so there was a great piece written in the Times last week by a Black queer man talking about, my therapist right now is like, you're glowing. And he's talking about the impact that working from home has had from him and not having to deal with the daily microaggressions from white colleagues. And this is our work. And in this time that we can be at home, we can read all the books, right? But we have to translate that into action. And I think that talking with our white colleagues is a huge place, important place for us to start to do that.
And Minda, in your book, The Memo, you talk about how those microaggressions that you experienced in corporate America really impacted your career, and eventually you left it because of those. Since you've written this book, what has changed? And speaking to the remote workers who are on the stream in terms of how they're impacted with their work, they're not seeing their boss. It may be challenging for them to show up right now. What would you say to them?
Yeah, I first just want to hold space for all of the people of color, even our allies who are having a hard time dealing with this, because the reality is we often come into the workplace, and I write about it in the memo. The Trayvon Martin situation is what prompted me to start doing this advocacy work, because I went into the office afterwards and nobody said anything. My manager didn't acknowledge that this had happened or any of the other brutalities. And I think it's really tough when we're asked to bring our authentic selves to work and nobody recognizes us, our Black pain inside the workplace. And I think we have to address those issues. And so one of the things that I found since the memo came out, yes, it's helped women of color, Black women. They already had a voice, but finding out how they want to use it. But what I'm finding more, Caroline, is that they're experiencing more microaggressions in this remote environment. So yes, there is a little reprieve. You don't have to see that person in the hallway or in the break room, but they're still being silenced on the Zoom calls. They're still being talked over in the Zoom calls. Those important meetings that are talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, they're not a part of those. They don't see anyone who looks like them making decisions for them. And I think we really have to hold our feet to the fire to make sure that at the highest levels, there are people representing the pain that we are experiencing in and outside the workplace. And so if you are an ally, one of the things that you can do inside your chat box, I'm not saying, just holler out inside the Zoom call, right? Or the Skype call, whatever you're using, but, say, hey, Bob, Minda was actually talking. I'd like for her to finish her thought. Those are ways in which we can show up. We're talking about active allyship. And I'm so thankful that you're having this conversation, because it's not enough to say that we're an ally. We have to lean into our courage and push aside our caution, because as Jess said, it's going to require some activation. We can't just read the books, but now that you've read the books, what are you going to do with the information that you found?
Well, Minda, I've seen some members in the stream echoing your sentiment. Isabel says, our leaders need to protect us against racism behaviors. It is important to live in a free country with justice and not racism, and solving all kinds of problems. Kumar says, active ally is defined by those that step out of their comfort zones, place themselves at peril, help the others less fortunate, while holding on to fear for their own safety and health. Torin, let's go to you. A lot of your work focuses on helping people have uncomfortable conversations and letting go of this notion that I am a good person, therefore I am not racist. Talk us through how that changes right now and what people need to be thinking about as they're thinking about reaching out to their colleagues and stepping up and doing the work.
I appreciate that question. I think that this is one of the gifts that I've been able to give to this space. It's being able to hold safe space and allow people to cry or to talk about things that they don't normally feel comfortable talking about, but being in a safe space where you're vulnerable and you're able to have authentic conversation, I think is where we grow. there is no growth in this work without getting uncomfortable. So I like to say, get uncomfortable with being uncomfortable. We know that the workplace has been the single greatest place where you will interact with difference. And even though we have that opportunity, that is not always maximized because we don't acknowledge the power of proximity. The fact that when we show up to work, when we clock in, when we're on our Zoom calls, we're not likely to interact with people like this in our communities necessarily. And so this is, I believe, the richest place for us to make a difference. And in that same sense, I think about the event of Amy Cooper, right? This is somebody who people thought was a good person. But how many of us need to check our privilege, check the way that we actually think about the world? Where did our belief systems come from? Where did our ideas come from? And I've been just blown away with how many white people I've seen in my social media feeds actually speaking out and acknowledging their privilege and talking about the things that they don't have to worry about. Things like, I don't have to worry about getting discriminated against for my hair, for example, or for my skin color. Getting stopped for for running a light doesn't scare me, right? And so there's so many different parts of this, but I think being able to lean into that discomfort is what active allyship is about. It's about seizing the opportunity to be around people that are not like you and to go on the journey together. I think that one of the hardest things for people to understand is that you can't judge people based upon where they are in the journey. You're not going to help unless you bring them along. And each person is starting from a different point. I've met white women who married interracially and tried to bring home their spouse to their family and got turned away and didn't get let in the door again. Another white woman at an event, she said she had to confront her uncle about having a Confederate flag in the basement and why he had it, just showcased the way that he did. Because she was like, that just doesn't sit well with her. And she had a courageous conversation with her own family member. And so I think that's the hard part. We're wired to be comfortable, but when we start to unwire and when things like this stir us and just push us completely to feel stirred and feel that emotional charge, it's up to us to harness this moment right now. And really just take a hold of the change that we can make in our workplaces, in our society, in our communities, and do it together. So I'm just inspired by all the action that I'm seeing. I'm inspired by that group of white people that blocked off the protesters in front of the police. We know just how much of a difference that made for their safety in that moment. So people are putting their bodies on the line. They're putting their words on the line, their reputations on the line. And this is the time to do it. If not now, when?
And Megan, I know that you're quite close right now to the protests in Seattle. And last week you wrote about what Torin's talking about, which is this idea of being okay with being wrong and just stepping up to the plate and having these uncomfortable conversations. From your seat, in terms of the people who are on the stream and are trying to learn, what do you think is important for them to know right now?
Yeah, I think it actually connects back to some of the things that Minda was saying. And so when you think about microaggressions, some of the more traditional things that you think about in the workplace are certainly important. But when you think about it in the context of what's happening right now, showing up to work either virtually or physically and having peers, managers, mentors not even aware or recognize what happens also feels like a microaggression. It sort of signifies you don't know what is harming me and therefore you don't value me. And so helping people understand that taking the time to call it out, to recognize it, is an important step in helping employees and coworkers feel included. And so as you asked, I think the opportunity to get comfortable with getting it wrong. Torin talked about getting uncomfortable. Part of that is you're going to make mistakes. And I think a lot of folks start in this work and believe they have to get it perfect. They have to have the perfect line or the perfect statement or the perfect act. At the end of the day, I've talked to so many people within the Black community at Microsoft and other companies who say, we just want somebody who's willing to try to make the mistake and be willing to put themselves at risk and even just getting it wrong on our behalf. And so pushing people to be comfortable with that and being willing to kind of just understand that we will give you grace if you try, if you show up. The part where it gets hard is when we see people not showing up.
Right. I'm seeing some members in the stream echoing everyone's sentiments. Lou says, when you're most uncomfortable is when you learn and grow the most. Brianna says, I'm a Black woman, and if I had to say something to inspire people reaching out to their Black coworkers, it's be active, realize your thoughts and actions before you even do them. Don't ask me what I need, realize what I need, see me for who I am. So Brianna, Lou, thank you for joining this conversation. Jess, you lead a workshop on whiteness at work, and it's challenging for white people to recognize their race. And so to even lead a workshop that's called Whiteness at Work, I'd love just to hear a little bit of how you put together that program and some things that maybe the members on the stream right now could benefit from what you're teaching and how that changes in this remote environment.
Absolutely. Well, first, I want to recognize Desiree and Adaway and Erica Hines, two of my colleagues who we partner, and I've learned so much from them. First, I also just want to respond around actual actions that we can take. And some of the things I've seen organizations do is let's pay folks for mental health days. If therapy isn't covered on your health plan, let's pay for folks who need therapy. I had an organization we worked with this week who sent out an email to all employees and said, if you want to protest, let us know and we will pay for that day off. So those are just some tangible things that I wanted to note there. In terms of, you mentioned that white people can have a hard time seeing a race. And something I like to talk about is, so I grew up in New Hampshire, a state that's was 98% white when I was growing up. I never thought of myself as a white person. I always thought about myself as Jessica. And this is a huge way that white supremacy inculcates itself, is that I don't even see it. I never think when I was growing up, did the kids say this thing in the hallway because of my skin color? So I have all of this extra psychic freedom that I don't have to use walking through the world wondering if I was treated or the person said that or this outcome happened to me because of my race. And so part of that in the workplace is to really recognize the power that we have inherently based on our skin color. And to start thinking about whiteness as a group identity, not just ourselves as individuals. And so in this program, Whiteness at Work, it's a free training that we're doing next week, and then it builds out into a summer program. It's really to help us all understand the ways in which white dominant culture shows itself in the workplace. And so we look at things like perfectionism, that we always have to get it right. We look at defensiveness, tasks over relationships. A lot of this was brought to light by the work of Tema Okun, who wrote an excellent piece that I encourage people to go look at around white supremacy culture in the workplace. And so helping give people language to point to these things when they're happening, so that we can step back, take some time to do some analysis before we take action. So we try to make the next right best action and limit harm. And then really listen and put folks from historically marginalized identities who are underrepresented in our organizations, put them in positions of power and resource them and listen to them.
Mm-hmm. Great points. And some members in the stream are saying that as well. Belinda says, I'm so glad this conversation is taking place. It's long overdue. Natalie says, well said. The fear of saying the wrong thing is real and paralyzing. I know this is a part of my privilege. I want to go ahead and take some questions in the stream. We have tons of questions from members from all the insights that you are sharing on the show. And I'll open it up and see who wants to take this one. But this is from Teresa. She says, what about trying to have those conversations and being the only person of color? How should I approach it? I sat on a call today with colleagues and it wasn't even acknowledged. Mm-hmm. Linda, maybe you can take it away there.
First of all, I'm sorry. I am sorry that your coworkers failed you, right? And I'm sure all of them see themselves as really great people, but this is where it matters, right? This is where the rubber meets the road. And I think it's really important. I've seen some people in the comments saying, well, just talk about it, just say it. But it's not the same when you are not the majority inside the workplace, right? There are historical consequences when Black women speak up, because then we're deemed as the angry Black woman or the feisty Latina, they're docile Asian. So I think it's important that we do document these things and we have these conversations. And I talk about having courageous conversations and then hoping that the person on the other side will be a courageous listener. Let's see each other through the lens of empathy, because it took a lot of courage to come and talk to you about being microaggressed, right? Even intentional or unintentional. But I think the only way that we solve some of these problems is if we lean into that courage and have these conversations, because the reality is not all of our colleagues know what they're doing, right? How do you know that you're being harmful if we don't tell you? And so that's one of the reasons why I wrote the memo, because I wanted to take the pressure off of every Black woman, every woman of color to have to always educate. And so this is a way that we could do that. And so, but oftentimes I say, you know, if it bothers you enough that you go back to your seat or go back to your couch and it's playing on a reel and you beat yourself up for not saying it, go back to that colleague and in a diplomatic way, let them know what they did and give them the benefit of the doubt. Because if we were oppressing people inside the workplace, I would want someone to tell me as well. And so I think it's important that we open up that dialogue, because that's the only way we're going to get to any kind of healing.
Thank you for that perspective. Karen says, being an ally is a journey where we try, learn, make mistakes, and keep going. There are so many members on the stream who have questions and are just so thankful for your time. Before we go, I wanted to give everyone an opportunity to give a word of encouragement to those who are challenging through this time, and perhaps tell us how they think that perhaps that this is going to move, how we're going to deal with this moving forward, and any silver linings to us having these productive conversations on LinkedIn. Maybe Megan, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I don't know that I have a silver lining, but I will say I think we will address this by committing to being willing to make those mistakes, to have the conversations, to get it wrong, to start with prioritizing the needs of the people that we're trying to be an ally for. And so while it is hard to recognize that this needs to be the catalyst to how this starts showing up in the workplace in a new way, I think we need to seize this opportunity to do it. If we let this go by, if we ignore it, if we don't talk about it, we will be missing a major opportunity to make significant change, not only in the workplace, but in the larger conversation, because these are, you know, sort of the future leaders of the world. And so if we can't have this conversation in the workplace, we're never going to make the change beyond the workplace.
That's such a great point. Torin, what about you?
I just want to say that there's a reason why How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi is sold out right now. It is one of the best books that I've ever read. The opposite of racist is not racist. And so many people have, I'm sure we all know people who have said, I'm not racist, or maybe we've even said it ourselves at some point. But the goal is the journey of striving to be anti-racist and always learning about different ways that inequity and systemic racism shows up in our workplaces, in our communities, in our healthcare systems, in our society in which we live, and being able to trigger your beautiful and a big brain around what are the things that I could be doing? What are the ways that I could be leading right now in this conversation and showing up for people and showing up for this work? And the ways that I could be dismantling or shifting the system so that it functions in a way that serves everyone in an equal and equitable way. So my just word for everyone is, use this moment to stir your emotion and move. Use this moment to show up more bravely and more strong than you ever have. Because if there was ever a chance to really just activate the inner activist in you, the employee activist in you, right now is the time. So I'm super excited for all of your journeys. I'm with you. The emotions that you feel, the sadness, the grief, the frustration, the anger, I feel them too. And these emotions will ultimately lead us to someplace in better than where we are now. And I'm confident that we'll be able to do that. So
we certainly hope you're right, Torin. Thank you so much for that perspective. Jess, what are you thinking right now?
I'm thinking a lot about conviction, and that this work does take time, but I know building a race equity culture is something that you can do. Equity in the Center, if you go to their site, they've done an incredible research project white paper on what does that actually really look like? What is a race equity culture? And I think if we can kind of wrap our heads around that and have an idea of what we're working towards, that's a really big first step. So I encourage folks to do that. The other piece is let this be a start. To Torin's point, I'm excited about the journey that folks are starting or continuing or have renewed conviction around, but this work does take time. You are not going to solve this overnight. You are not going to solve this in the next 6 months. Under the conditions of COVID, right? Inequity is already present and our organizations are being amplified. So let's use those lessons and commit to doing this work over the long haul.
Great perspective. And I see that Minda has dropped out. I was going to bring her in one last time, but we may have lost her to another meeting. Members in the stream are saying, Lysandra says, thank you for sharing your experiences and voices. This is a humanity issue. It goes beyond politics. We have to work together to make this change. Cassandra says, I'm glad this conversation is occurring. Oftentimes it's hard to express ourselves in the workplace without being labeled the emotional one, even if expressions of our feelings or words are low-key or tapered, to try to have uncomfortable dialogue. Panel, I know I speak for the stream when I say thank you for creating space for us to have this uncomfortable conversation on LinkedIn. I learned so much personally, and I know that everyone else did as well. Thank you for taking the time, and be safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to thank our panel for this uncomfortable conversation about how to be an active ally at work. It was an illuminating conversation for me, and I'm seeing from so many in the stream that you enjoyed it as well. So thank you for joining us. This is Business Unusual, a live show where we are discussing how the coronavirus is impacting the ways that we work. We come to you daily from the LinkedIn news page at 12 Eastern. I'll be back here tomorrow at noon as well for another conversation about this topic. So please join us then. I'm Caroline Fairchild. Thank you so much.